The Roman Emperor Augustus had more than 50 official wives, but he never really loved any of them. Because marriage wasn't about love, it was about political power, and the system was much darker. Please let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you in the comments. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Roman Empire stood as one of history's most powerful civilizations, dominating the Mediterranean world for over 1,000 years. Yet beneath the gleaming marble temples and triumphant military parades lay a complex web of marriage customs that would shock modern sensibilities. What most people today consider natural and normal, the idea of marrying one person for love and remaining faithful until death, was completely foreign to ancient Roman society, especially among the wealthy and powerful. To understand Roman marriage, one must first grasp that Roman society was rigidly stratified into distinct social classes, each with its own rules, expectations, and privileges. At the very top sat the Patricians, the ancient noble families who claimed descent from Rome's original senators. These families controlled vast estates that stretched across multiple provinces, commanded private armies, numbering in the thousands, and wielded enormous political influence that could make or break emperors. Their villas were architectural marvels, filled with Greek sculptures, exotic animals, and libraries containing thousands of scrolls. A single patrician household might employ hundreds of slaves, artisans, and administrators to maintain their luxurious lifestyle. Below the patricians were the plebeians, free citizens who formed the backbone of Roman society as merchants, artisans, soldiers, and farmers. These individuals enjoyed certain legal protections and could participate in political assemblies, but their influence paled in comparison to the patrician elite. A successful plebeian merchant might accumulate considerable wealth through trade networks spanning the empire, but he could never achieve the social status or political power that came with patrician birth. Many plebeians spent their entire lives hoping to gain favor with a patrician patron who might elevate their family's circumstances through marriage alliances or business partnerships. At the bottom of the social ladder were the slaves, who comprised nearly 30% of the empire's population. These individuals had no legal rights whatsoever, and were considered property rather than people. They could be bought, sold, beaten, or killed at their master's whim. Some slaves lived in relatively comfortable circumstances as household servants, tutors, or skilled artisans, while others endured back-breaking labor in mines, fields, or gladiatorial schools. The constant threat of rebellion kept slave owners vigilant and often cruel, creating an atmosphere of fear and tension that permeated every level of society. For patrician families, marriage was never about personal happiness or romantic love. It was a calculated business transaction designed to consolidate wealth, forge political alliances, and ensure the continuation of family bloodlines that stretched back centuries. A patrician father would begin planning his daughter's marriage alliance while she was still an infant, carefully studying the political landscape and identifying families whose connections could advance his own ambitions. Marriage negotiations might take years to complete, involving detailed discussions about dowries, property transfers, and future political support. The prospective husband would be chosen not for his kindness, intelligence, or compatibility with the bride, but for his family's political connections, military achievements, or financial resources. A father might promise his 12-year-old daughter to a 40-year-old senator if that alliance could secure important votes in the Roman Senate, or provide access to lucrative government contracts. The girl's personal feelings about the arrangement were considered irrelevant. Her duty was to serve her family's interests without question or complaint. The concept of matrimonium, or formal Roman marriage, carried specific legal requirements and social expectations that governed every aspect of the relationship. A valid marriage required the consent of both families paterfamilias, the eldest male head of household who held absolute legal authority over all family members, including the power of life and death. This authority, known as patria potestas, meant that adult children could not make independent decisions about marriage, property, or even their choice of residence without their father's explicit permission. The bride needed to be at least 12 years old, according to Roman law, though many were married even younger through betrothal contracts that legally bound them to their future husbands. These child brides would continue living with their birth families until they reached physical maturity, at which point they would be transferred to their husband's household. The psychological trauma of being separated from one's family at such a young age was considered a necessary sacrifice for the greater good of political alliance and social stability. The groom typically needed to be at least 14 years old. Though wealthy patrician men often waited until their 20s or 30s to marry their first wives, this delay served multiple purposes. It allowed young men to complete their military service, establish their political careers, and accumulate enough wealth to support multiple households. During this bachelor period, they were expected to gain sexual experience with slaves, prostitutes, and lower-class women, ensuring they would be skilled lovers capable of producing legitimate heirs with their aristocratic wives. However, the Romans recognized multiple categories of conjugal relationships beyond formal marriage, creating a complex hierarchy of romantic and sexual partnerships that reflected the empire's rigid class structure. Concubinatus was a legally recognized form of cohabitation between a man and a woman of different social classes. Unlike marriage, concubinage did not require the consent of families, formal ceremonies, or religious ritual. A patrician man could take a plebeian woman as his concubine without any legal complications, though their children would not inherit his full social status or property rights. The most shocking aspect of Roman conjugal customs to modernize was the complete social acceptance of multiple simultaneous relationships. A wealthy Roman man was not only permitted but actually expected to maintain several different types of partnerships simultaneously. He would have a formal wife from his own social class for political purposes and legitimate heir production, one or more concubines for companionship and sexual pleasure, and numerous female slaves who had no legal right to refuse his advances. This arrangement was not considered adultery or infidelity. It was simply the natural order of things for those with sufficient wealth and social status. Roman law made careful distinctions between these various relationships, with each category carrying specific rights, obligations, and social expectations. Matrimonium created powerful legal bonds that affected inheritance patterns, property ownership, and social standing within the community. Children born from formal marriages were considered legitimate heirs who could inherit their father's wealth, political positions, and social connections. These legitimate children received the best education, military training, and marriage opportunities available to their class. Concubinatus, while socially acceptable and legally recognized, did not confer the same protections or privileges. Concubine relationships were more flexible and could be terminated more easily than formal marriages, but they also offered less security for the women involved. Children born from concubinage were acknowledged by their fathers and often received education and financial support, but they could not inherit patrician status or claim equal portions of the family estate. These children occupied a middle ground between legitimate heirs and slaves, often serving as administrators, military officers, or marriage partners for less prestigious families. The most vulnerable women in this complex system were the slaves, who had no legal protections whatsoever. Roman masters had complete sexual access to their female slaves, who were considered property rather than partners in any meaningful sense. These relationships were not romantic or consensual. They were expressions of power, ownership, and domination. Slave women who bore their masters' children might receive marginally better treatment, improved living conditions, or even eventual manumission, but they had no legal recourse if they were mistreated, sold to other owners, or arbitrarily separated from their children. The economic implications of maintaining this elaborate marriage system were staggering. Even for the wealthiest patrician families, supporting multiple households, providing dowries for numerous daughters, funding elaborate wedding ceremonies for political alliances, and maintaining hundreds of dependents could strain even the most extensive family fortunes. Some patrician estates supported thousands of people: wives, concubines, legitimate children, acknowledged bastards, slaves, freedmen, clients, and extended family members, all dependent on the paterfamilias for their survival and prosperity. Roman wedding ceremonies themselves reflected these practical political considerations rather than romantic ideals or personal affection. The most formal and prestigious type of marriage, known as confariatio, involved elaborate religious rituals overseen by the Pontifex Maximus and required the presence of 10 witnesses from distinguished families. This ceremony was reserved exclusively for patrician families and created the strongest possible legal bonds between the couple and their respective households. The bride would be formally transferred from her father's legal authority to her husband's in a ceremony that resembled a carefully orchestrated property transaction more than a celebration of love or personal commitment. During the conferatio ceremony, the bride would wear a distinctive flame-colored veil called a flammeum and a special white tunic bound with a woolen belt tied in the knot of Hercules. Her hair would be arranged in an elaborate style, using a bent iron spear point, symbolizing her transition from virginity to married status. She would be led in solemn procession from her father's house to her new home, accompanied by musicians, torchbearers, and wedding guests who would chant traditional songs celebrating fertility and prosperity. Upon reaching her husband's threshold, she would declare, "Ubi tu Gaius, ego Gaia." Where you are Gaius, I am Gaia, formally accepting her new identity as an extension of her husband's legal and social persona. The symbolic elements of this ceremony emphasized the bride's complete submission to her new household's authority. She would touch fire and water, representing her acceptance of her husband's household gods and her willingness to participate in the daily religious observances that govern patrician family life. The sharing of a special cake made from spelt flour called fareum libum symbolized the couple's spiritual unity and their joint responsibility for maintaining the family's religious obligations to their ancestors and protective deities. However, this elaborate ceremony represented only the public face of patrician marriage arrangements. Behind the ritual pageantry lay a complex web of negotiations, contracts, and ongoing political obligations that would govern the relationship for years to come. The bride's family would provide a substantial dowry, often including landed estates, slave households, jewelry, fine clothing, and significant amounts of gold or silver. This dowry remained technically the bride's property throughout the marriage, though it would be administered by her husband and could be used to support his political career or business ventures. In return, the groom's family would provide marriage gifts and guarantee the bride's social status within their household hierarchy. She would receive her own quarters within the family villa, personal slaves to attend her daily needs, and an allowance for clothing, entertainment, and religious offerings. More importantly, she would gain access to her husband's political network, social connections, and economic opportunities that could benefit her birth family's interests for generations. The reality of patrician married life bore little resemblance to modern concepts of companionate marriage or emotional intimacy. Husbands and wives often lived essentially separate lives within their shared household, coming together primarily for formal meals, religious ceremonies, and the production of legitimate heirs. A typical patrician villa was designed to accommodate this arrangement, with distinct areas for men's and women's activities, separate dining facilities for different social occasions, and private quarters that allowed family members to pursue their individual interests without constant interaction. The husband would spend most of his time managing his estates, pursuing his political career, commanding military expeditions, or engaging in business ventures that required extensive travel throughout the empire. He might be absent from home for months or even years at a time, leaving his wife to manage household affairs, supervise the education of their children, and maintain social relationships with other patrician families. During these separations, both spouses were expected to remain faithful to their marriage vows, though the definition of fidelity differed significantly for men and women. For patrician men, fidelity meant avoiding relationships with other men's wives or daughters, but sexual encounters with slaves, prostitutes, or lower-class women were considered perfectly acceptable and even necessary for maintaining masculine reputation. A man who showed no interest in sexual conquest might be suspected of lacking the aggressive temperament required for military and political success. Wealthy Romans often competed to acquire the most beautiful and skilled concubines, viewing their sexual prowess as another form of conspicuous consumption that demonstrated their superior status. The concubine system operated according to well-established social protocols that governed everything from living arrangements to inheritance rights. A patrician man might maintain his primary concubine in a separate villa, complete with her own household staff, personal slaves, and entertainment facilities. This woman would enjoy a lifestyle far superior to most free citizens, with access to luxury goods, cultural events, and social connections that elevated her far above her birth status. However, she remained entirely dependent on her patron's continued favor and could be dismissed or replaced at any time without legal recourse. More casual concubine relationships might involve women who lived in the main household alongside the legal wife and legitimate children. These arrangements required careful management to prevent jealousy, conflict, and disruption of the family's social standing. Successful patrician wives learned to treat their husbands' concubines with polite indifference, neither acknowledging them as equals nor treating them with obvious hostility. Some wives even formed alliances with favored concubines, using them as sources of information about their husbands' activities and potential political threats. The children produced by these various relationships created additional layers of complexity within patrician households. Legitimate sons would receive the finest education available, studying rhetoric, philosophy, military strategy, and political theory under renowned tutors imported from Greece or other cultural centers. They would be groomed from childhood for careers in politics, military command, or estate management, with their father's influence opening doors that would otherwise remain closed. Legitimate daughters would be prepared for advantageous marriages that would further expand the family's political network and economic resource. Children born to concubines occupied an ambiguous middle ground within the household hierarchy. While they could not inherit their father's political offices or claim equal shares of his estate, they often received generous support that allowed them to pursue careers in business, scholarship, or military service. Some achieved considerable success and wealth in their own right, using their father's connections and their own talents to build independent power bases. Others remained essentially dependent on their father's goodwill throughout their lives, serving as administrators, agents, or informal advisors within the family's various enterprises. The economic burden of supporting multiple families and households often strained even the wealthiest patrician fortunes. A single marriage alliance might require years of financial planning, with families borrowing money, selling property, or entering into complex business partnerships to fund the elaborate ceremonies and generous gifts expected for such occasions. The ongoing costs of maintaining multiple households, educating numerous children, and supporting extended networks of dependents and clients could consume vast amounts of wealth that might otherwise be invested in profitable enterprises or political advancement. Some patrician families attempted to manage these costs through strategic marriage planning that maximized political benefits while minimizing financial obligations. They might arrange marriages between cousins or other relatives to keep dowries within the extended family, or negotiate delayed payment schedules that spread the financial burden over several years. Others entered into marriage alliances with wealthy plebeian families, trading social status for immediate financial relief and access to new sources of income. The pressure to maintain multiple successful relationships while managing complex household dynamics led many patrician men to develop sophisticated social skills and political acumen that served them well in their public careers. They learned to balance competing interests, mediate disputes, manage resources efficiently, and project authority while maintaining the loyalty and cooperation of diverse groups of dependents. These same skills proved invaluable in the Roman Senate, military command, and provincial administration, where success depended on the ability to build coalitions, negotiate compromises, and maintain control over large organizations. However, the emotional and psychological costs of this system were often severe. Many patrician marriages were marked by mutual indifference, resentment, or active hostility, as spouses struggled to reconcile their personal desires with their social obligations. Depression, alcoholism, and various forms of self-destructive behavior were common among both men and women who felt trapped in relationships that offered little emotional satisfaction or personal fulfillment. The marriage practices of Roman emperors represented the ultimate expression of how political power and personal relationships intertwined in ancient Rome. Unlike ordinary patrician families who merely sought to advance their local influence through strategic marriages, emperors used matrimonial alliances to reshape the entire political landscape of the Mediterranean world. Their choices in wives, concubines, and romantic partners could trigger wars, establish new dynasties, or fundamentally alter the balance of power between competing factions within the empire. Augustus, the first Roman emperor, established many of the precedents that would govern imperial marriage policy for centuries to come. His own romantic history illustrated the complex calculations that drove elite Roman relationships. As a young man named Gaius Octavius, he had been engaged to the daughter of a political ally. But this betrothal was broken when political circumstances changed. He then married Clodia Pulchra, but divorced her almost immediately to pursue a more advantageous alliance with Scribonia, a woman significantly older than himself, whose previous marriages had connected her to important senatorial families. The marriage to Scribonia served Augustus's immediate political needs by providing access to her extensive network of relatives and allies, but it offered little personal satisfaction. Contemporary sources describe their relationship as cold and formal, focused entirely on the production of legitimate heirs and the management of political obligations. Scribonia bore Augustus one daughter, Julia, but their marriage deteriorated rapidly as Augustus became increasingly infatuated with Livia Drusilla, the beautiful young wife of another nobleman. Augustus's pursuit of Livia created one of the greatest scandals of the early imperial period. Livia was already married to Tiberius Claudius Nero, and was pregnant with their second child when Augustus decided he must have her as his wife. Rather than accepting this obstacle, Augustus used his growing political influence to pressure Livia's husband into agreeing to a divorce. The negotiations were conducted with ruthless efficiency. Tiberius Claudius Nero was offered significant financial compensation, political appointments, and guarantees of protection for himself and his children in exchange for relinquishing his wife. The arrangements satisfied everyone's immediate interests, except perhaps Livia herself, whose personal feelings about being traded between powerful men were never recorded or considered relevant. She divorced her husband and married Augustus in 38 BCE, just 3 days after giving birth to her second son. This unseemly haste shocked even Roman society, which was accustomed to pragmatic marriages and flexible moral standards. Critics whispered that Augustus was so consumed with lust that he could not wait a decent interval before claiming his prize. However, Augustus's marriage to Livia proved to be one of the most successful and enduring partnerships in Roman history. Unlike his previous wives, Livia possessed the intelligence, ambition, and political acumen necessary to serve as a true partner in governing the empire. She managed Augustus's household affairs with remarkable efficiency, supervised the education and marriages of their children and stepchildren, and developed her own network of allies and informants throughout the Roman world. More importantly, she understood that her own power and security depended entirely on Augustus's continued success and devoted herself to supporting his political objectives. The couple's public relationship became a model for imperial marriage that subsequent emperors would attempt to emulate. They appeared together at state ceremonies, religious festivals, and public entertainments, presenting themselves as a united team committed to the welfare of the Roman people. Augustus consulted Livia on important policy decisions, appointed her relatives to significant positions, and publicly acknowledged her contributions to his achievements. In return, Livia maintained absolute discretion about her husband's numerous extramarital affairs and focused her energy on managing the complex dynamics of the imperial household. Behind this facade of marital harmony, Augustus continued to maintain relationships with multiple concubines and mistresses throughout his reign. His sexual appetite was legendary, even by Roman standards, and he made little effort to conceal his conquests from either his wife or the general public. Contemporary historians recorded his affairs with the wives of prominent senators, actresses, prostitutes, and female slaves with a matter-of-fact tone that reflected the accepted nature of such behavior for men of his status. One of Augustus's most notorious relationships involved Terentia, the wife of the famous orator Marcus Tullius Cicero. This affair created significant political complications because Cicero was attempting to maintain neutrality in the civil wars that preceded Augustus's rise to power. When rumors of the affair became public, Cicero found himself in an impossible position. He could not openly criticize Augustus without risking retaliation, but neither could he ignore the humiliation of his wife's infidelity. The situation contributed to the breakdown of Cicero's marriage and ultimately to his political downfall and assassination. Augustus also maintained long-term relationships with several women who occupied positions somewhere between wives and concubines. These women lived in separate villas maintained at imperial expense, bore Augustus's children, and participated in court ceremonies and social events. Their children were acknowledged as members of the imperial family and received educations, dowries, and marriage arrangements befitting their status, though they could never inherit the throne or claim equal status with Augustus's legitimate heirs. The emperor's marriage policies extended far beyond his personal relationships to encompass the marriages of his relatives, allies, and potential successors. Augustus arranged dozens of strategic marriages among members of the imperial family, senatorial aristocracy, and foreign nobility, to create a web of loyalties that would support his dynasty's continued rule. His daughter Julia was married 3 times to different men chosen for their political value rather than their compatibility with her personality or preferences. Julia's first marriage, to Marcus Claudius Marcellus, was designed to position Augustus's nephew as his potential successor, while simultaneously binding the powerful Claudian family more closely to the imperial cause. When Marcellus died unexpectedly at a young age, Augustus quickly arranged for Julia to marry Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, his most trusted general and closest friend. This marriage served multiple purposes. It rewarded Agrippa's loyalty, provided Augustus with grandsons who could eventually inherit the throne, and demonstrated that merit and service to the state would be recognized even above aristocratic birth. After Agrippa's death, Augustus forced Julia into a third marriage with Tiberius, Livia's son from her first marriage. This arrangement was purely political, designed to ensure a smooth succession by binding Augustus's biological daughter to his chosen heir through matrimonial bonds. Neither Julia nor Tiberius wanted this marriage. They disliked each other intensely and had completely incompatible personalities. But their personal preferences were irrelevant compared to the political necessity of consolidating power within the imperial family. The unhappy marriage between Julia and Tiberius illustrated one of the fundamental problems with using marriage as a tool of political control. While strategic marriages could create temporary alliances and formal bonds between families, they could not guarantee genuine loyalty, emotional commitment, or effective cooperation between the individuals involved. Julia eventually rebelled against her father's control by engaging in a series of scandalous affairs that violated Roman moral standards and threatened the imperial family's reputation for virtue and propriety. Augustus's response to Julia's behavior revealed the tensions inherent in imperial marriage policy. As a father, he might have been expected to show some understanding for his daughter's desire for personal happiness and emotional fulfillment. As an emperor, however, he could not allow her actions to undermine the moral authority that legitimized his rule. He chose to exile Julia to a remote island, where she lived in isolation and poverty until her death, serving as a warning to other family members about the consequences of placing personal desires above political obligation. The marriage practices established by Augustus were continued and expanded by his successors, each of whom faced similar challenges in balancing personal desires with political necessities. Tiberius, despite his own unhappy marriages, arranged strategic alliances for his relatives and potential heirs. Caligula shocked Roman society by marrying his sisters and engaging in incestuous relationships that violated fundamental religious and social taboos. Claudius married 4 times, with each marriage serving different political purposes and creating new complications for imperial succession. Nero's marriage to Poppaea Sabina illustrated how imperial romantic obsessions could destabilize the entire political system. Nero was already married to Octavia, the daughter of Emperor Claudius, when he became infatuated with Poppaea, the wife of his friend Otho. Rather than conducting a discreet affair, Nero decided he must marry Poppaea and began systematically destroying the obstacles to this union. He divorced Octavia on fabricated charges of adultery, executed several prominent nobles who opposed the marriage, and eventually had Octavia killed to prevent her from serving as a rallying point for his enemies. The marriage to Poppaea satisfied Nero's personal desires, but created significant political problems that contributed to his eventual downfall. Octavia had been popular with the Roman people, who viewed her execution as unnecessarily cruel and tyrannical. The prominent families who had supported her began plotting against Nero, while provincial governors and military commanders questioned his judgment and fitness to rule. The emperor's obsession with his new wife distracted him from governing effectively and allowed various conspiracies to develop throughout the empire. Later emperors attempted to learn from these mistakes by developing more sophisticated approaches to marriage diplomacy. The Flavian dynasty, which included Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian, emphasized pragmatic marriages that served clear political objectives without creating unnecessary scandals or alienating important constituencies. Vespasian maintained a long-term relationship with Antonia Caenis, a freed woman who had been secretary to Antonia Minor, but he never married her because such a union would have violated social conventions and weakened his political standing. Titus faced a more complex situation when he fell in love with Berenice, a Jewish queen who had supported Rome during the Jewish Wars. Their relationship was passionate and enduring, but marriage between a Roman emperor and a foreign queen would have created religious and political complications that could have destabilized the entire Eastern Mediterranean. Titus ultimately chose duty over love, sending Berenice away and remaining unmarried for the rest of his short reign. The Antonine dynasty, which ruled during the 2nd century CE, developed perhaps the most sophisticated approach to imperial marriage policy. These emperors typically maintained stable, long-term marriages with women from established Roman families, while also pursuing carefully managed relationships with concubines and mistresses, who posed no threat to political stability. They arranged marriages for their relatives that strengthened alliances with provincial elites and created networks of loyalty throughout the empire. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, exemplified this approach through his marriage to Faustina the Younger, daughter of Emperor Antoninus Pius. Their marriage combined genuine affection with political calculation, producing numerous children who served as potential heirs and marriage partners for other noble families. Despite persistent rumors about Faustina's extramarital affairs, Marcus Aurelius maintained his commitment to their marriage and publicly defended his wife's reputation. understanding that attacking her would ultimately weaken his own position. The marriage policies of the Severan dynasty reflected the empire's increasing diversity and the growing influence of provincial elites. Septimius Severus married Julia Domna, a Syrian woman from a prominent family in Emesa, creating the first imperial marriage between a Roman emperor and a foreign noblewoman since Mark Antony's relationship with Cleopatra. This marriage symbolized the empire's transformation from a Roman institution into a truly multinational political system that incorporated elites from throughout the Mediterranean world. The concubine and slave system that operated alongside formal Roman marriages created a complex hierarchy of women whose lives and circumstances varied dramatically depending on their legal status, physical appearance, skills, and the temperament of their masters. This system was not merely an informal arrangement tolerated by Roman society. It was a legally recognized and carefully regulated institution that played a crucial role in the empire's social, economic, and political structure. At the apex of this hierarchy stood the official concubines, known as concubinae, who enjoyed legal recognition and social respectability despite their unmarried status. These women were typically freeborn citizens of lower social classes, who entered into formal agreements with wealthy patrician men. The relationship was governed by specific legal protocols that defined the rights and obligations of both parties, though these protections were far less comprehensive than those afforded to legitimate wives. A patrician man seeking to establish a concubinage relationship would typically negotiate with the woman's family, or if she was already independent, directly with the woman herself. These negotiations resembled business contracts more than romantic courtships, focusing on practical matters such as living arrangements, financial support, inheritance rights for any children produced by the union, and the conditions under which the relationship might be terminated. The most fortunate concubines were established in their own households, complete with personal slaves, household staff, and monthly allowances that allowed them to live in considerable luxury. These women occupied a unique position in Roman society. They were neither wives nor slaves, but something entirely different that commanded its own form of respect and social recognition. They could own property, conduct business transactions, and participate in religious ceremonies, though they were excluded from the most prestigious social events reserved for married women of the patrician class. Marcus Crassus, one of the wealthiest men in Roman history, maintained a famous concubine named Tertulla in a villa that rivaled the homes of many senators. Tertulla supervised her own household of 30 slaves, hosted elaborate dinner parties for Crassus's business associates, and accumulated considerable wealth through her own investment activities. When Crassus died, he left Tertulla a substantial inheritance that allowed her to purchase her own estate and live independently for the remainder of her life. However, the majority of concubines lived within their patron's primary household, occupying quarters that were comfortable but clearly subordinate to those reserved for the legal wife and legitimate children. These women had to navigate complex social dynamics, carefully managing their relationships with the wife, legitimate children, household slaves, and visiting dignitaries who might view them as either threats to be eliminated or opportunities to be exploited. Successful concubines developed sophisticated social skills that allowed them to maintain their position and influence within these complicated households. They learned to provide companionship and entertainment without appearing to challenge the wife's authority, to bear and raise children without creating succession disputes, and to accumulate wealth and property without triggering jealousy or resentment among other family members. Claudia Act, the concubine of Emperor Nero, exemplified this delicate balancing act. Originally a slave who had been freed and elevated to concubine status, Acti maintained Nero's affection for over a decade by providing the emotional support and intellectual companionship that his formal marriages could not offer. She bore him several children, accumulated substantial wealth, and wielded considerable influence over imperial policy. Yet she managed to avoid the political conspiracies and violent end that befell many of Nero's wives and relatives. The children born to concubines occupied an ambiguous but not insignificant position within Roman society. While they could not inherit their father's political offices or claim equal shares of his estate, They were typically acknowledged, educated, and provided with opportunities that elevated them far above their mother's original social status. Many became successful merchants, military officers, scholars, or administrators who served their father's interests while building independent careers and fortune. Some patrician men took considerable pride in their concubine children and invested heavily in their education and advancement. Julius Caesar's relationship with Servilia produced a son, Marcus Junius Brutus, who received the finest education available and was groomed for a career in politics despite his irregular birth status. Ironically, Brutus would eventually join the conspiracy to assassinate his own father, demonstrating that even the most carefully cultivated relationships could not guarantee loyalty or prevent political betrayals. Below the concubines in this hierarchy were the countless female slaves who had no legal protections whatsoever and existed entirely at their master's discretion. Roman law granted slave owners absolute sexual access to their human property, and this right was exercised routinely throughout the empire. Female slaves were expected to submit to their master's advances without resistance, and any attempt to refuse could result in severe punishment, sale to a harsher owner, or even death. The experiences of slave women varied dramatically depending on their master's character, their own skills and appearance, and the specific circumstances of their enslavement. Some were treated relatively well, particularly those who possessed valuable abilities such as literacy, musical talent, medical knowledge, or exceptional beauty. These women might be assigned to comfortable positions within the household, given better food and clothing than field slaves, and even allowed to form relationships with other slaves or freedmen. The most privileged female slaves were those selected to serve as personal attendants to the master's wife or concubines. These women often developed close relationships with their mistresses and might be granted considerable autonomy in managing household affairs. Some accumulated small amounts of personal property, learned valuable skills such as hairdressing or massage, and eventually earned their freedom through loyal service or by bearing their master's children. However, the vast majority of female slaves endured lives of grinding hardship and constant vulnerability. They worked long hours at physically demanding tasks, received minimal food and shelter, and lived under the perpetual threat of sexual assault, physical violence, or arbitrary punishment. Those assigned to agricultural estates, mines, or manufacturing workshops faced particularly brutal conditions that often resulted in injury, illness, or early death. The breeding of slaves represented one of the most dehumanizing aspects of the Roman slave system. Masters routinely forced female slaves to reproduce in order to increase their human property holdings and reduce the costs of purchasing new workers. These breeding programs treated women like livestock, pairing them with male slaves based on physical characteristics and potential offspring rather than personal compatibility or consent. Children born to slave mothers automatically inherited their mother's legal status, regardless of their father's identity or social position. This meant that even children fathered by their master remained slaves unless specifically freed through formal manumission procedures. Many masters found it economically advantageous to maintain these children as slaves, rather than acknowledging them as free offspring, particularly if they showed potential value as workers or if the master already had sufficient legitimate heir. The psychological trauma inflicted by this system was immense and often generational. Slave mothers watched helplessly as their children were sold, assigned to dangerous work, or sexually exploited by the same masters who had abused them. They could not protect their offspring, provide them with proper educations, or ensure their safety and well-being. This constant state of powerlessness and fear created deep psychological wounds that persisted even when slaves eventually gained their freedom. Some female slaves attempted to improve their circumstances by actively seeking their master's sexual attention, calculating that pregnancy might lead to better treatment, manumission, or at least some measure of protection for themselves and their children. This strategy sometimes succeeded, Masters who developed emotional attachments to particular slaves might treat them more kindly, provide them with better living conditions, or eventually grant them freedom and financial support. However, this approach carried enormous risks. Masters who lost interest in a particular slave woman might sell her to a harsher owner, assign her to dangerous work as punishment, or simply ignore the children she had borne him. Some masters deliberately rotated their sexual partners among their female slaves to prevent emotional attachments from developing and to maintain absolute control over their household dynamics. The manumission process offered the only legal path to freedom for slave women, but it remained entirely dependent on their master's goodwill and could be revoked at any time before completion. Masters might promise freedom to encourage cooperation and productivity, but they were under no legal obligation to honor these promises. Even when manumission occurred, newly freed women faced significant challenges in establishing independent lives and supporting themselves and their children. Freed women, as they were called, occupied a legal category, distinct from both slaves and freeborn citizens. They could own property, engage in business activities, and marry other freedmen or slaves, but they remained bound to their former masters through various obligations and restrictions. They might be required to continue working for their former owner for a specified period, provide ongoing services or payments, or submit to ongoing supervision of their activities and relationship. Despite these limitations, many freed women managed to build successful independent lives. Some established small businesses such as bakeries, textile workshops, or taverns that catered to other freed slaves and lower-class citizens. Others leveraged skills learned during their enslavement, such as literacy, accounting, or craft production, to find employment with different masters or to work as independent contractors. The most successful freed women were often those who had borne children to their former masters and maintained ongoing relationships that provided them with financial support and social protection. These women might receive substantial gifts, property bequests, or business opportunities that allowed them to accumulate considerable wealth over time. Some eventually became slave owners themselves, purchasing other women and men to work in their households or businesses. The complexity of relationships between masters, concubines, and slaves created numerous opportunities for conflict, manipulation, and intrigue within Roman households. Wives might attempt to undermine their husbands' concubines through gossip, sabotage, or direct confrontation. Concubines competed among themselves for their patrons' attention and resources. Slaves sought to improve their positions by providing information about their rivals' activities or by forming alliances with more powerful household members. These dynamics were further complicated by the presence of children from various relationships who might have conflicting interests and loyalties. Legitimate sons might view their half-brothers born to concubines as threats to their inheritance and political prospects. Daughters born to slaves might resent the privileges enjoyed by their half-sisters born to free mothers. Masters had to carefully balance these competing interests while maintaining overall household harmony and their own authority over all family members. The economic costs of maintaining multiple women and their children could be substantial, even for wealthy patrician families. Providing adequate food, clothing, shelter, and medical care for dozens or even hundreds of household members required careful financial planning and efficient resource management. Some masters attempted to reduce these costs by selling surplus children, particularly daughters who would eventually require dowries, or by manumitting older slaves who were no longer productive workers. The legal and social status of women in the Roman Empire's complex marriage system varied dramatically based on their birth circumstances, family connections, and the specific nature of their relationships with men. This intricate hierarchy created vastly different lived experiences for women who might share the same household but occupied completely different positions within its power structure. Understanding these distinctions reveals how gender, class, and legal status intersected to create opportunities for some women while severely limiting others. At the pinnacle of female status stood the matrone, legitimate wives of patrician men who enjoyed the highest social rank available to women in Roman society. These women possessed significant legal rights that distinguished them from all other categories of females in the empire. A matrona could own property in her own name, inherit wealth from her parents and husband, initiate divorce proceedings under certain circumstances, and exercise considerable authority over household management and child-rearing decisions. The property rights of patrician wives were particularly extensive and represented one of the most progressive aspects of Roman law for its time period. A woman's dowry remained technically her own property throughout her marriage, though it would be administered by her husband and could be invested in his business ventures or political career. If the marriage ended through divorce or the husband's death, the woman could reclaim her dowry along with any increases in its value that had occurred during the marriage. Fausta, the wife of Emperor Constantine, provides an excellent example of how wealthy matronae could leverage their property rights to maintain independence and influence even within troubled marriages. When Constantine began showing interest in other women and considering changes to his succession plans, Fausta quietly transferred substantial portions of her wealth to accounts controlled by her birth family and loyal freedmen. This financial maneuvering gave her resources to oppose her husband's policies and ultimately contributed to the political crisis that led to her own execution, though not before she had secured her children's positions and protected her family's long-term interests. Matronae also possessed important religious authority that extended their influence beyond the domestic sphere into public life. They served as priestesses in various cults, organized and funded religious festivals, and participated in state ceremonies that reinforced the legitimacy of their husband's political power. The most prestigious religious position available to women was that of Vestal Virgin, though these priestesses were required to remain unmarried and therefore occupied a unique category outside the normal marriage system. The daily life of a matrona revolved around managing complex household operations that might include hundreds of slaves, multiple properties, and extensive business interests. She would typically rise before dawn to review the previous day's accounts, meet with household stewards and managers, and plan meals, entertainment, and religious observances for the coming day. Her morning would be spent receiving visits from clients, freed women, and other matronae who sought her influence, advice, or financial support. Afternoon activities might include supervising her children's education, attending social gatherings with other patrician wives, or participating in religious ceremonies at various temples throughout the city. Evenings were often devoted to formal dinners where political alliances were negotiated, business deals were arranged, and marriage contracts were discussed. These social events required sophisticated diplomatic skills, as matronae had to balance competing interests while maintaining their family's reputation and advancing their husband's career objective. The education provided to future matronae reflected their expected roles as household managers and political partners. Wealthy families hired private tutors to teach their daughters literacy, numeracy, rhetoric, and the classical literature considered essential for cultured conversation. They also received instruction in music, dance, and other accomplishments that would make them attractive marriage partners and successful hostesses. However, this education was carefully limited to ensure that women did not develop ambitions that might conflict with their primary duties as wives and mothers. They were not taught military strategy, legal advocacy, or political theory, subjects considered inappropriate for females regardless of their social status. This educational restriction ensured that even the most privileged women remained dependent on male relatives and advisors for guidance in areas deemed beyond their natural capabilities. The marriage arrangements of matronae were typically negotiated by their fathers or male guardians with minimal input from the women themselves. A patrician daughter might meet her intended husband only once or twice before the wedding ceremony, and even then only in the presence of chaperones who ensured that no inappropriate intimacy developed. The focus of these premarital meetings was to assess compatibility of temperament and ensure that both parties could fulfill their expected roles rather than to determine romantic attraction or personal affection. Once married, a matrona's relationship with her husband was expected to be cordial and mutually supportive, but not necessarily affectionate in the modern sense. Emotional intimacy was considered less important than practical cooperation in managing household affairs and producing legitimate heirs. Many patrician couples lived essentially parallel lives within their shared household, coming together for formal occasions and family business, but maintaining separate social circles and personal interests. The reproductive expectations placed on matronae were enormous and often dangerous. They were expected to produce multiple sons to ensure family continuity and provide backup heirs in case of military casualties or political executions. Daughters were also valuable as potential marriage partners who could create new political alliances. But too many daughters could become a financial burden due to dowry obligations. Pregnancy and childbirth posed significant risks in an era without modern medical knowledge or sanitary practices. Many matronae died in childbirth or from complications related to repeated pregnancies. Those who survived multiple births often suffered from chronic health problems that affected their quality of life and ability to fulfill their household responsibilities. The pressure to continue bearing children despite these risks created enormous stress and anxiety that was rarely acknowledged or addressed. Livia Drusilla, the wife of Emperor Augustus, exemplified both the opportunities and constraints faced by women at the highest levels of Roman society. She wielded enormous behind-the-scenes influence over imperial policy, managed vast household operations, and successfully positioned her sons from her first marriage as Augustus's heirs. However, she was constantly criticized for being too ambitious and manipulative, with contemporary historians suggesting that her influence over her husband was unnatural and dangerous. The treatment of widowed matronae revealed both the privileges and limitations of their legal status. A wealthy widow could inherit substantial property and gain considerable autonomy that had been impossible during her marriage. She could choose whether to remarry, support political candidates, fund public works projects, or establish independent business ventures. Some widows became powerful patrons who controlled significant networks of clients and wielded influence comparable to that of male senators. However, widowed matronae also faced pressure from their deceased husband's family, their own relatives, and government officials who had interests in their wealth and connections. Remarriage was often strongly encouraged or even mandated, particularly for younger women who might bear additional heirs. The choice of a second husband was subject to political considerations and family pressures that might override the woman's personal preferences, just as completely as her first marriage had been arranged. Below, the matronae and social status were the concubines, whose legal rights and daily experiences differed significantly from those of legitimate wives despite their often comfortable living circumstances. Concubines had no claim to their partner's property beyond what he chose to give them voluntarily. They could not inherit his wealth, initiate divorce proceedings, or demand support for their children. Their security depended entirely on maintaining their patron's favor and affection. The most successful concubines developed strategies for protecting themselves and their children that often involved accumulating independent wealth through business activities or gifts from multiple patrons. Some established networks of female friends and allies who could provide support and protection if their primary relationship ended. Others cultivated relationships with their patron's legitimate wife and children, positioning themselves as valuable household members rather than threatening rivals. Clodia Metelli, the sister of a prominent politician and widow of another, chose to live as the concubine of various powerful men rather than entering into another formal marriage that would have subjected her to a husband's legal authority. This arrangement allowed her to maintain control over her substantial inherited wealth, while enjoying the protection and social connections that came from association with influential men. Though she was criticized by contemporary moralists for her unconventional lifestyle, she successfully maintained her independence and influence for decades. The children of concubines faced particular challenges in navigating Roman society's complex social hierarchies. While they were typically acknowledged by their fathers and received better education and opportunities than slaves, they could never achieve the same status as legitimate children. Sons might pursue military careers or business ventures but were unlikely to hold major political offices. Daughters might receive dowries that allowed them to marry respectable men, but they would not be considered suitable wives for the highest-ranking patrician families. Despite these limitations, many children of concubines achieved considerable success and social mobility. Their irregular birth status sometimes motivated them to work harder and develop greater skills than their legitimate half-siblings, who took their privileges for granted. Some became wealthy merchants, successful military commanders, or influential scholars who earned respect through their achievements rather than their parentage. The freed women occupied perhaps the most precarious position within the hierarchy of Roman women. Having gained their liberty from slavery through manumission, they possessed legal rights that slaves lacked but remained bound to their former masters through ongoing obligations and social restrictions. They could own property, engage in business activities, and marry other freedmen. But they could not marry freeborn citizens without special permission, and their children would inherit their mother's freed status rather than full citizenship rights. Many freed women found themselves caught between worlds, no longer slaves but not yet fully accepted as free citizens. They might accumulate considerable wealth through business success, but still be excluded from respectable society due to their origins. Some former slave women who had borne children to their masters found themselves in particularly ambiguous situations, maintaining ongoing relationships with their former owners while attempting to establish independent lives for themselves and their offspring. The most successful freed women often were those who had acquired valuable skills during their enslavement that could be monetized after manumission. Former household managers might establish boarding houses or catering businesses that served other freedmen and lower-class citizens. Women who had learned textile production, jewelry making, or other crafts could set up independent workshops that competed with free artisans. Some freed women accumulated enough wealth to purchase slaves of their own, creating complex hierarchies within their households that reflected their own experiences of bondage and liberation. These women often treated their slaves more harshly than freeborn owners, perhaps because they understood too well the temptations and opportunities for resistance that slaves might exploit. The legal system that governed women's rights in marriage and property ownership evolved slowly throughout the imperial period, generally in the direction of greater freedom and autonomy for upper-class women. The old requirement that wives remain under their husband's complete legal authority gradually gave way to more flexible arrangements that allowed women to maintain some control over their inherited property. The grounds for divorce were expanded to include more situations where women could initiate proceedings, and the division of property in divorce cases became more equitable. However, these legal improvements primarily benefited wealthy women who had the resources and connections necessary to navigate the complex judicial system. Poor women, slaves, and freed women continued to face significant legal and practical barriers that limited their opportunities for independence and self-determination. The gap between the experiences of women at different social levels remained enormous throughout the imperial period. The complex marriage system that governed Roman society created numerous unintended consequences that gradually undermined the very foundations of the empire. It was designed to support What began as a pragmatic arrangement to consolidate wealth and political power eventually evolved into a source of chronic instability that contributed to economic decline, social fragmentation, and political chaos. The costs of maintaining multiple households and supporting extended networks of wives, concubines, and their children became so enormous that even the wealthiest patrician families struggled to meet their obligation. The economic burden of the Roman marriage system was staggering in its scope and complexity. A single patrician household might support hundreds of dependents, including multiple wives, numerous concubines, dozens of legitimate and illegitimate children, hundreds of slaves, and extended networks of clients and freedmen who relied on the family's patronage for their survival. The annual costs of providing food, clothing, housing, education, medical care, and entertainment for these massive extended families could exceed the revenues generated by vast agricultural estates or lucrative government contracts. Marcus Licinius Crassus, reputed to be the wealthiest man in Roman history, maintained detailed financial records that reveal the extraordinary expenses associated with his complex family arrangements. His primary household in Rome included his legal wife, 3 acknowledged concubines, 14 children from various relationships, and over 400 slaves. The annual cost of feeding this extended family exceeded the total tax revenues collected from several small provinces. Additional expenses for clothing, entertainment, education, and gifts to maintain political alliances consumed vast additional sums that required constant attention to generate sufficient income. The pressure to maintain these expensive lifestyles drove many patrician families into increasingly risky financial arrangements that ultimately proved unsustainable. They borrowed money at high interest rates to fund elaborate wedding ceremonies and generous dowries that were expected for political marriages. They entered into speculative business ventures with uncertain returns in attempts to generate the enormous revenues needed to support their extended households. Some families mortgaged their ancestral estates or sold valuable properties to raise cash for immediate obligations, gradually eroding the foundation of their long-term wealth and status. The marriage system also created perverse incentives that encouraged corruption and abuse of political power. Politicians needed vast sums of money to support their complex family arrangements, making them susceptible to bribery, embezzlement, and other forms of financial misconduct. Provincial governors who might otherwise have been content with modest personal enrichment felt compelled to extract maximum profits from their territories to fund their household expenses back in Rome. This systematic exploitation contributed to widespread resentment and rebellion throughout the empire's provinces. The competition for advantageous marriages created additional economic distortions that affected the entire Roman economy. Families spent enormous sums on luxury goods, elaborate ceremonies, and expensive gifts designed to demonstrate their wealth and attract desirable marriage partners for their children. These expenditures diverted capital from productive investments in agriculture, manufacturing, and infrastructure that might have strengthened the empire's economic foundation. Instead, vast resources were consumed in essentially wasteful displays of conspicuous consumption that generated no lasting value. The social consequences of the marriage system were equally problematic and far-reaching. The constant competition for status and resources created deep resentments and lasting hostilities between families who might otherwise have cooperated for their mutual benefit. Children from different marriages and relationships within the same household often viewed each other as rivals rather than siblings, creating internal conflicts that weakened family unity and effectiveness. These domestic tensions frequently spilled over into public life, contributing to political instability and factional disputes that paralyzed government decision-making. The treatment of women within this system created additional sources of social tension and conflict. Legitimate wives often deeply resented their husbands' concubines and worked to undermine their influence through gossip, sabotage, and political intrigue. Concubines competed fiercely among themselves for their patrons' attention and resources, sometimes resorting to violence or poison to eliminate rivals. The children of these various relationships inherited their mother's resentments and rivalries, perpetuating conflicts across generations. Agrippina the Younger, the mother of Emperor Nero, exemplified how these family dynamics could escalate into political crises that threatened the entire empire's stability. Her rivalry with other women in the imperial household, particularly her husband's previous wives and their children, drove her to increasingly desperate measures including murder, conspiracy, and open rebellion against imperial authority. Her actions ultimately contributed to a series of political upheavals that weakened the Julio-Claudian dynasty and paved the way for civil war. The psychological toll of living within these complex and often hostile family arrangements was enormous for all involved. Men struggled to balance the competing demands and expectations of multiple wives and concubines while maintaining authority over their extended households. Women faced constant insecurity about their status and survival, knowing that their security depended entirely on maintaining their partner's favor in the face of numerous rivals. Children grew up in environments characterized by rivalry, suspicion, and emotional manipulation rather than nurturing and stable family relationships. The educational system that prepared young people for participation in this marriage system often exacerbated rather than resolved these problems. Boys were taught to view women primarily as instruments for advancing their political and economic interests rather than as partners or companions. Girls were educated to compete with other women for male attention and resources rather than to develop independent skills or interests. These educational patterns perpetuated the dysfunctional relationships that characterized Roman family life and prevented the development of more healthy and sustainable social arrangements. The legal system that governed marriage and family relationships became increasingly complex and contradictory as it attempted to address the numerous conflicts and disputes that arose from polygamous arrangements. Courts were constantly occupied with inheritance disputes, custody battles, and property conflicts between competing wives and their children. The resolution of these cases often required enormous amounts of time and money, further draining resources from productive activities and contributing to social instability. The religious dimensions of Roman marriage added another layer of complexity and potential conflict to these arrangements. Different families worshipped different gods and followed different ritual practices, creating difficulties when marriages united households with incompatible religious traditions. The integration of foreign wives and concubines from conquered territories introduced additional religious diversity that sometimes created theological disputes and cultural conflicts within individual households. The military implications of the marriage system were particularly serious given Rome's dependence on constant military expansion and conquest to fund its elaborate lifestyle. The enormous expenses associated with maintaining multiple households and supporting extended families meant that patrician men needed to pursue increasingly aggressive and risky military campaigns to generate sufficient wealth. This pressure contributed to the empire's overextension and ultimate inability to defend its borders against external threats. Young men who might have devoted themselves to military service or other productive careers were often distracted by the complexities of managing their family relationships and the constant need to generate income to support their dependents. The time and energy devoted to marriage negotiations, household management, and family politics reduced the human resources available for effective governance and military leadership. The demographic consequences of the marriage system also contributed to long-term social problems that weakened the empire's foundation. The practice of abandoning or killing unwanted children, particularly daughters who would eventually require expensive dowries, led to gender imbalances and population decline among the upper classes. The constant warfare and political instability associated with competition for resources further reduced the population of productive adults available to maintain the empire's economic and military strength. The moral decay that many contemporary observers associated with the marriage system reflected deeper structural problems that the Romans were unable or unwilling to address effectively. The normalization of adultery, the acceptance of violence against women and children, and the general treatment of human relationships as commercial transactions created a culture that valued power and wealth above loyalty, compassion, and genuine human connection. The corruption of traditional Roman values that had originally emphasized duty, honor, and service to the state was particularly evident in the marriage practices of the imperial family itself. Emperors who were supposed to serve as moral exemplars for the entire empire instead became notorious for their sexual excesses, violent treatment of their wives, and dynastic intrigues that prioritized personal interests over public welfare. The economic inequality that the marriage system both reflected and reinforced became increasingly extreme over time, creating a society divided between a tiny elite who controlled vast resources and a massive population of slaves, freedmen, and impoverished citizens who struggled for basic survival. This inequality contributed to social unrest, political instability, and the eventual breakdown of the civic institutions that had made Roman expansion and prosperity possible. The administrative challenges of governing an empire populated by millions of people living under different legal systems and social arrangements became increasingly unmanageable as the marriage system created ever more complex family relationships and inheritance patterns. Provincial governments struggled to determine citizenship status, property rights, and legal jurisdiction in cases involving individuals whose ancestry included multiple marriages, adoptions, and manumissions across several generations. The military recruitment system, that had originally depended on citizen soldiers, motivated by patriotic duty and the prospect of land grants, was gradually undermined by the marriage system's emphasis on wealth accumulation and status competition. Young men from patrician families were increasingly reluctant to risk their lives in military service when they needed to focus on managing their complex family relationships and business interests. This reluctance contributed to the empire's growing dependence on foreign mercenaries and barbarian allies whose loyalty was questionable and whose integration into Roman society was problematic. The infrastructure maintenance and public works projects that had originally been funded by wealthy citizens eager to demonstrate their civic virtue were increasingly neglected as patrician families devoted their resources to private luxury and family expenses rather than public benefit. Roads, aqueducts, temples, and other essential infrastructure began to deteriorate, undermining the economic and social foundations that had made Roman civilization possible. The gradual collapse of the Roman marriage system did not occur overnight, but rather unfolded across several centuries as internal contradictions and external pressures combined to make the traditional arrangements increasingly untenable. The rise of Christianity, the growing influence of barbarian cultures, economic decline, and political instability all contributed to fundamental changes in how Romans understood marriage, family relationships, and social obligation. These transformations ultimately helped reshape European civilization and established patterns that would influence Western marriage customs for over 1,000 years. The emergence of Christianity as a major force in Roman society, beginning in the 3rd century CE, posed a direct challenge to the traditional marriage system that had governed elite Roman families for centuries. Christian teachings emphasized monogamy as a divine commandment, condemned adultery and concubinage as sinful behaviors, and promoted the ideal of marriage as a spiritual partnership between equal souls, rather than a political or economic transaction between families. These radical ideas attracted growing numbers of converts who were dissatisfied with the moral compromises and emotional emptiness that characterized traditional Roman marriages. The conversion of Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century marked a turning point that accelerated the transformation of Roman marriage customs. Constantine's own family history illustrated the tensions between traditional Roman practices and emerging Christian values. He had been married to Fausta while maintaining relationships with several concubines, and his sons from different relationships had competed violently for succession rights in ways that scandalized Christian observers. After his conversion, Constantine began implementing legal reforms that reflected Christian influence, though he moved carefully to avoid alienating the still powerful pagan aristocracy. The Theodosian Code, promulgated in 43 CE, represented the most comprehensive attempt to reconcile Christian marriage ideals with Roman legal traditions. This legal compilation restricted divorce, penalized adultery more severely, and provided greater protection for the property rights of legitimate wives. However, It also included numerous exceptions and qualifications that reflected the practical difficulties of completely overturning centuries of established custom and the resistance of powerful families who benefited from traditional arrangements. The economic pressures that had been building throughout the 3rd and 4th centuries also contributed to the decline of the traditional marriage system. The enormous costs of maintaining multiple households and supporting extended networks of dependents became increasingly difficult to sustain as the empire's revenues declined due to military setbacks, administrative corruption, and the loss of productive territories to barbarian invasions. Many patrician families simply could no longer afford the elaborate lifestyle that had characterized earlier generations. The debasement of Roman currency and chronic inflation made it increasingly difficult to maintain the luxury goods, elaborate ceremonies, and generous gifts that had traditionally demonstrated family wealth and status. The disruption of trade networks due to constant warfare reduced the availability of exotic products and skilled artisans that had previously enabled conspicuous consumption. Agricultural productivity declined as military campaigns devastated farmland and slave rebellions disrupted labor systems, reducing the income available to support expensive family arrangement. The barbarian migrations of the 4th and 5th centuries introduced new cultural influences that challenged traditional Roman marriage customs. Gothic, Vandal, Frankish, and other tribal societies typically practiced different forms of marriage that emphasized personal choice, emotional bonds, and more egalitarian relationships between spouses. As these groups settled within Roman territories and intermarried with Roman families, their customs gradually influenced local practices and created hybrid arrangements that combined elements from different traditions. The Visigothic king, Alaric, who sacked Rome in 410 CE, married a Roman noblewoman in a ceremony that blended Gothic warrior traditions with Christian rituals, creating a new model that influenced subsequent marriages between barbarian leaders and Roman aristocrats. These mixed marriages often involved genuine emotional attachments and more equal partnerships than had been typical in traditional Roman arrangements, demonstrating alternative approaches to family formation that appealed to many observers. The military crisis that dominated the later empire also contributed to changes in marriage patterns, as constant warfare reduced the male population and created new opportunities for women to exercise greater autonomy. Widows of military commanders often found themselves controlling significant resources and making independent decisions about remarriage, property management, and political alliances. Some chose to remain unmarried and focus on managing their estates and protecting their children's interests, rather than subjecting themselves to new husbands' authority. Galla Placidia, the daughter of Emperor Theodosius I, exemplified this new type of independent woman who navigated the changing political landscape through strategic marriages and autonomous decision-making. After being captured by Visigothic forces, she married their king Ethelf in what appeared to be a genuine love match, rather than a purely political arrangement. When Ethelf was assassinated, she returned to Roman territory and eventually married the general Constantius. But she maintained significant political influence and property control throughout these relationships. The administrative reforms implemented by Diocletian and his successors inadvertently contributed to changes in marriage customs by creating new bureaucratic positions that required educated personnel from diverse backgrounds. The expansion of the civil service created opportunities for social mobility that had previously been limited to traditional aristocratic families. Talented individuals from lower social classes could now achieve wealth and status through government service, reducing their dependence on advantageous marriages for advancement. The establishment of Constantinople as a new imperial capital in 330 CE created additional opportunities for social and cultural change. The new city attracted ambitious families from throughout the empire who were seeking opportunities in the expanding bureaucracy and court system. This mixing of diverse populations and traditions created a more cosmopolitan environment where traditional Roman marriage customs competed with alternative approaches from Greek, Persian, Syrian, and other cultures. The legal profession also underwent significant changes that affected marriage and family law. The development of specialized legal scholars who focused on family law created a more sophisticated understanding of the problems inherent in the traditional polygamous system. Legal commentators increasingly criticized the inefficiencies and inequities of arrangements that created chronic disputes over inheritance, custody, and property rights. Some recommended reforms that would simplify family structures and reduce opportunities for conflict. The rise of monasticism provided an entirely new alternative to traditional marriage that attracted growing numbers of both men and women who were dissatisfied with secular family arrangements. Monastic communities offered spiritual fulfillment, intellectual stimulation, and social purpose that many found more satisfying than the political calculations and emotional compromises required for success within the traditional marriage system. The growth of these communities reduced the pool of potential marriage partners among the most educated and spiritually inclined members of society. The economic transformation of the later empire also created new forms of wealth that were less dependent on traditional agricultural estates and more focused on commerce, manufacturing, and professional services. Successful merchants, artisans, and professionals could accumulate substantial fortunes without relying on inherited property or advantageous marriages. This economic independence allowed them to make marriage choices based on personal preference rather than family pressure, contributing to the development of more companionate relationships. The demographic changes that accompanied the empire's decline also influenced marriage patterns in significant ways. The recurring plagues, famines, and military disasters of the 3rd through 5th centuries reduced the overall population and created gender imbalances in many regions. These demographic shifts forced families to adjust their marriage strategies and made it more difficult to maintain traditional arrangements that depended on the availability of numerous potential partners from appropriate social backgrounds. The gradual barbarization of the Roman military created additional pressures for change as German, Hun, Allan, and other tribal groups brought their own marriage customs into Roman society. Military commanders who had risen from barbarian backgrounds often established marriage patterns that reflected their cultural origins rather than Roman traditions. Their success and influence encouraged other families to adopt similar practices, contributing to the gradual transformation of elite marriage customs. The fiscal crisis that dominated the later empire made it increasingly difficult for the government to provide the economic incentives and legal protections that had previously supported the traditional marriage system. Tax collection became irregular and often oppressive, reducing the wealth available to support extended households. Legal institutions became less reliable as courts were overwhelmed with cases and officials were frequently corrupt or incompetent. These institutional failures undermined the foundations that had made complex family arrangements viable for earlier generations. The intellectual and cultural changes that accompanied the empire's transformation also influenced attitudes toward marriage and family relationships. The revival of classical learning during the 4th and 5th centuries included renewed interest in Greek philosophical traditions that emphasized personal virtue, emotional fulfillment, and individual autonomy rather than purely political or economic consideration. These intellectual currents influenced educated Romans to seek more personally satisfying relationships rather than accepting purely instrumental marriages. This survival and transformation of Roman marriage customs in the post-imperial period demonstrates both the persistence of traditional practices and their adaptation to changing circumstances. In the Eastern Empire, Byzantine marriage law maintained many Roman features while incorporating Christian modifications that emphasized monogamy and spiritual partnership. The Western kingdoms that emerged after Rome's fall developed hybrid systems that combined Roman legal traditions with barbarian customs and Christian moral teachings. The medieval European marriage system that eventually emerged from this synthesis retained some elements of Roman practice, particularly the emphasis on marriage as a tool for creating political alliances and consolidating wealth. However, it also incorporated Christian ideals of monogamy and spiritual partnership that had gradually undermined the Roman polygamous system. The result was a new synthesis that would dominate European family life for the next 1,000 years. Modern observers examining the rise and fall of the Roman marriage system can identify several lessons that remain relevant to contemporary discussions about family structure, gender roles, and social organization. The Roman experience demonstrates how marriage customs that initially serve important social and economic functions can become dysfunctional and counterproductive if they fail to adapt to changing circumstances. It also illustrates how individual behavior and institutional arrangements interact in complex ways that can produce unintended consequences. The Roman system's ultimate failure resulted not from external conquest or natural disasters, but from internal contradictions that gradually undermined its effectiveness and sustainability. The enormous costs of maintaining multiple households, the social conflicts created by competing wives and children, the psychological damage inflicted by treating human relationships as commercial transactions, and the moral corruption that accompanied the systematic exploitation of women and slaves, all contributed to the system's eventual collapse. Perhaps most significantly, the Roman experience suggests that sustainable marriage and family systems must balance individual fulfillment with social stability, personal choice with community obligations, and economic considerations with emotional and spiritual needs. Systems that sacrifice human happiness entirely for political or economic advantages ultimately prove unstable and self-defeating. The gradual emergence of Christian marriage ideals that emphasized mutual love, spiritual partnership, and lifelong commitment represented a recognition of these deeper human needs that the Roman system had failed to address adequately. The transformation of Roman marriage customs thus represents more than simply a historical curiosity or an example of ancient moral decadence. It illustrates fundamental tensions between individual desires and social requirements that continue to influence contemporary debates about marriage, family structure, and gender roles. Understanding how the Romans addressed these challenges and why their solutions ultimately proved inadequate can provide valuable insights for modern societies attempting to develop sustainable approaches to family formation and social organization.